Well, this morning we're going to be picking back up in the Gospel of John, our study there that we put down right before Advent. And many theologians, we're going to be picking up in chapter 18, which people have described as the book of glory or exaltation. John likes to outline his books. He does this with the book of Revelation as well, where he'll start with a prologue, and then he'll have a section, and then a transition, then another section, then he'll end with an epilogue. In the Gospel of John, it's the same way. He starts with the beginning. In the beginning was the Word. He has this intro, and then he spends a lot of times pointing to Christ, the book of signs it's called. And then as we see the signs of Jesus, he repeats these signs, look, 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 look. And John says, look, behold, and see. And then in the middle, between 11 and 12, there's a transition where we begin to see the shift of Jesus, not just giving signs, but pointing to what would be his glory. And then in the last part of the book, John has the glory of Christ. And the glory of Christ, it is called the book of glory because John goes out of his way to clearly point us to the glory of God, which is the glory of Christ that begins and ends at the cross. The cross is not a means for Jesus' glory, but the cross is his glory. What we see on the cross is the full display of the glory of God, which John is very clear is the love of God, because that's what he is. God is love. And the full extent of Christ's love for us is displayed on the cross. And so when we look at the cross, John wants you and I to see very clearly, and anyone else who reads this gospel, he wants us to see and know that Jesus went there intentionally, he went there resolutely and willingly, and he went there persistently. Despite all of the resistance between man and the evil one, Jesus went after the cross. Now, the road of glory for Jesus is much different than the road of glory that many of us seek, the world seeks. We look at movies like Creed. My son Jesse and I have been on a Creed binge lately. Creed 3 is out, so the Rocky Balboa. It's a classic template. There's a story of kind of wanting to prove yourself, and then there's a challenge. Then there's a training montage. Any set of running or lifting, you just get the boxer bigger, and then there's the big scene of the fight. Then there's the glory, the knockout, and then they get the belt. Right? That's the template. That's the road to glory. Or the NCAA tournament. Right? Is anybody watching the tournament? Some of you, your brackets are busted. You know. Thank you very much, teams that were ranked number 12 or 15, knocking off number 1. And so the road to glory for many people seems to be this win after win after win, and then finally capped with scenes of bursting confetti and fireworks and trophies and salary bonuses and acquisitions, cheering crowds, banners of world leaders. There's hoisting the cup, and that's glory. Ah! Everybody go, ah! Oh, that sounded like crows. It was like, I modeled that for you. I should have expected. As soon as it came out of my mouth, I was like, that's not going to sound good. Jesus' road to glory, however, is much different than what was expected of him. It was anything but what the world expected, and even his disciples. And yet, he secures for himself in the cross a far greater glory than any man could ever accomplish or hope to attain. And the crazy thing about it is that the promise is that the glory that Christ himself receives from the Father is the same glory that he will share with us. Jesus' glory is on full display for everyone to see on the cross, and that's what we're moving towards. John's moving us towards the cross, and what he's doing is he's hoping that we will see that it's not the glory of man, but it's the glory of God in the cross, at the cross, that we see, and that we would receive it as truth. That the glory of Christ is in his death and in his burial and his resurrection and his ascension. But it starts at the cross. And to avoid the cross, to avoid that, to resist that, is antithetical to the gospel. Now, when we look at the cross, we think, why would anybody pursue sin and death and suffering and pain? That seems just contrary to what is in our gut and what we're told. But John, in this gospel, sets it up so that we would understand why it is that Christ went to the cross and why it is his glory and why the love of Christ is the thing that compels us to move forward in faith. It's not the thing that we need to earn. We don't need to earn our own redemption. We don't earn our own reconciliation. But it is because of the love of God, the glory of God, that moves us forward. and gives us eyes to see and ears to hear. So two things that I want us to watch this is a narrative, so we're going to walk through the story, but there's two things I want you to see unfold in the story of Jesus as he heads to his glorious death. One, we'll see that man's heart is exposed as being completely resistant to God's plan. Our resistance to God's plan is so embedded in us, even we don't know that we're resisting the goodness of God. We'll see this in Peter. We'll see that in three men as they represent all of mankind, because each of us can make a connection. We ought not to look at this narrative and be like, well, at least I wouldn't screw up like them. No, there is an element of our heart in them because they are men just like us. And so what we'll see that man's heart is exposed and they are resisting that which they do not know. Resistance is going where we don't want to go. Dogs don't want to bathe. Cats don't want to do anything for you. Kids don't want advice. We want to choose, you've heard this, I want to choose the path of what? Least resistance. What is easiest? None of us want to die. None of us willingly and joyfully will choose a path of suffering and death. None of us will naturally self-sacrifice ourselves. None of us will want to go towards pain. We do the opposite. So man's heart exposed here. Two, God's heart revealed in the persistence of Jesus carrying out God's plan. So the good news is that despite our resistance, right? Despite our resistance to God's overtures of love, Jesus persisted in accomplishing for us what we could not accomplish on our own. And it reveals God's heart. And therefore, in revealing God's heart, we love him and want to move towards him. So if you're taking notes, you can just divide it up into two things that will help frame these thoughts this morning. Our resistance and God's persistence. Our resistance and God's persistence. And we're going to see the resistance of our hearts through three different men. Now, this is a familiar story for some of you. In John 18, it's the story of Peter's denial of Jesus. Some of you may not be familiar with this story. Jesus is heading towards the cross, but the stage is set for Jesus' arrest way back in chapter 12. If you look with me at chapter 18, verse 3, it says that Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, it follows right after what John starts up as the preamble, is called the Book of Glory. As John starts in chapter 13 to set the stage for Jesus' time with his disciples, they're eating a meal together. That's where the upper room discourse is, where Jesus reveals things to the disciples that they don't not yet understand, but they're learning. He tells them ahead of time what's going to happen. And John starts to prepare us in the gospel, and he points to the moment that Jesus would come to in the cross. He says in chapter 12, verse 27, "My soul is troubled," he tells the disciples. "But what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But that is why I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." We begin to hear Jesus say that his hour is coming. John chapter 13, verse 1, Jesus knew that his hour had come. That's different because in the front end of the gospel, John says that Jesus would often say, "I can't do this because my hour has not yet come." But now Jesus has shifted and said, "My hour is here. It's time. It's time for me to depart from this world and go to the Father." And in 13, verse 1, he says, "Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." And so therefore, John sets up for us what we should expect. In John 13:33, he tells his disciples that where I'm going, you can't come with me. And we're going to see that as the disciples try to resist Jesus leaving them. He says, "You can't come with me. You can't come to the cross with me. You can't even go through the process with me. This is something that I must do on my own." Hence, Jesus will say, "Let them go, take me." John also rats out Judas the betrayer. He begins to let us know very clearly that Jesus knew, in fact, who would betray him. John 13:10 through 11, he tells the disciples after he's washed their feet, you're clean, but not all of you are clean. Not all of you have hearts that are pure. For he knew, verse 11, who would betray him. This is why he said, John says, not all of you are clean. A few verses later in John chapter 13:21, he says, truly one of you will betray me. John wants you and I to know that Judas knew exactly what he was doing. This is not a fault of Judas's kind of falling into the wrong crowd. He preemptively decided he was going to betray Jesus, and Jesus knew what was going to happen. In chapter 17, verse 1, it says that Jesus spoke these things, and he looked up to heaven, and he says, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, so that the Son may glorify you. And so after Jesus' high priestly prayer, he's just spent time saying, Father, I've kept these men safe. I've given them my word, and so now I want you to keep them safe. My time has come. Keep them so that those who would believe in their word might believe in the Son, so that they might glorify in you. Jesus knows who his betrayer is. He knows that his time has come. He knows exactly what he is going to do, and he knows exactly how he's going to do it, and he does it all masterfully. It's not haphazardly. He is orchestrating the redemptive plan of God without hesitation, without resistance, and without begrudging it. And so as Jesus moves forward, what you're going to see is you need to understand that Jesus followed the plan perfectly. And not only did he follow a plan, he executed the plan willfully. He made decisions that pointed to the fact that, lest there be any doubt, Jesus went to the cross for you on purpose. On purpose. He was thinking of you as he made decision after decision to fulfill the redemptive plan of God. So as Jesus moves forward, what you're going to see is you're going to see that there's resistance to this, that in our hearts we resist the redemptive plan of God through the betrayal of Judas. You're going to see Judas betray a friend, and he did this on purpose. You're going to see the violence and the fear that is in Peter's heart. Peter's going to try to resist the plan of God to take control, and he's going to do that in the garden. And then you're going to see the injustice of the Jews so that they can control. They're resisting the kingdom of God that is upon them. So look at verse 1, chapter 18. After Jesus had said these things, he went out with his disciples. He's in Jerusalem, and he's in the upper room, and they go across the Kidron Valley, and there's a garden there. There's a garden across the way. Here's some images. I went to Israel a few years ago, and so if you've ever been to Jerusalem and you look east, you'll see there's a valley. That's the Kidron Valley, and on the opposite end, Bethany is just over the hill, but that view from Jerusalem is a picture of what the valley looks like. So he would have come out of the city, gone down into the valley, and gone up into an olive grove, or what was a garden. Here's a picture of the garden. This is what it looks like. This is the actual Garden of Gethsemane, and that is what it looked like. Those trees might have been not as large, but there's an entire field of olive trees on that side. Here's a picture of me and my friend Dom, and there we are. There's the gate. I'm pretty sure that's one of the disciples there, but he didn't tell us to the left. He's pretty old. That is Hortus Gethsemane. Notice the Roman U. It's just a cool thing to do, guys. Come on. So, and then the next picture, let me show you. I just want to show you. I thought that this was kind of funny. It says, that's the valley. No explanations inside the church. I was like, that's ironic. But this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is where Jesus would have gone into, and he would have gone and he took them there because he was there all the time. Look at verse 2. Judas, who betrayed him. John will repeat Judas 3 times. He says, Judas who betrayed him. Some commentators think that he's repeating that because Judas was a common name, at least at that time. Amongst the church, you see a very accurate and probably right demarcation between amongst the Jews, Judas was a common name, and then after that, it was gone. Nobody named their kid Judas. You don't want to name your kid Adolf, right? It's kind of the thing. Like, don't name him something that is going to be associated with something as horrible as a betrayer of Christ. It says that Judas also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. He spent a lot of time there. He would take them there. It's where the other gospel writers say that Jesus went to pray. He said, let's go pray. It was a familiar surrounding. He took them to where it was familiar. Jesus, again, knew what was going on, and he took them into a space that was familiar to them. So they have no clue. They still have not pieced it together. We have the privilege of reading the scripture and being on a third party, and we're like, we know what the narrative is going to move towards. But the disciples didn't. They had no idea. They were just all swimming in their head. They just thought they were going to go to a garden. They were going to pray. But their semblance of normalcy is going to be shattered forever. In verse 3, Judas took a company of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and he came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Now, you have to understand, in the garden, it was walled off. And so when it says that they went into the garden, no doubt Jesus had set up something with the owner of the garden that he would be able to come and go as he pleased. but this was definitely a walled-off garden. This was a place where you did not want animals to come in, and you did not want people to just come in without permission. It was probably high enough so that it was a rough climb, but that you would know that I'm not supposed to be in here. And as every walled-off area that needs protection, there's one gate, and you can only go in one area. Jesus brings his disciples into this closed-off area, and here Judas is coming, and he took a company of soldiers. He's bringing a company of probably maybe 50 to 100 men, along with the officials and the chief priests and some messengers from the Jewish council of the Sanhedrin to come and to get Jesus. They have decided that they are going to get Jesus when the opportunity comes. Jesus told Judas in the upper room, he says, go and do what you're going to do. Jesus knows what's coming. And so what John wants you to understand is that Jesus has already told Judas, go do what you're going to do. Jesus knows that Judas is going to betray him. Jesus knows that Judas knows where Jesus would be if he needed rest and solitude. Therefore, note, Jesus went to the garden on purpose. He went there to be found on purpose. There's places in my house where I go to be hidden on purpose, and it doesn't work, right? We go to places to hide. Jesus did not go here to hide. He stepped right forward, and he said, Judas is going to find me here because this is where he knows I am all the time. And then look at verse 4. Jesus, knowing everything that was about to happen to him. Just think about that for a second. John writes everything, knowing everything that's about to happen to him. Oftentimes I get, if I know that I'm going to have a hard conversation with somebody, conflict where you get the cold sweat. So, I know none of you struggle with this, but I do. If I know that I'm going to have a conversation with somebody it's hard, and I start to sweat in my pits, and I get cold, and is it TMI, too much information? I'm sorry. You get that sick feeling in your stomach, and maybe you don't start off the conversation. We don't want to go. We try to figure out any time like there's a hint of canceling that appointment, like, oh, don't worry about it. You can, oh, no, it's still going to happen. Jesus felt all of that. In fact, the synoptists, the other gospel writers say that Jesus prayed. He said, Father, and he began to sweat drops like of blood, and he says, if there's any chance that this cup might pass, but rather not my will, but your will be done. Jesus was a man. He was fearful. He knew everything that was going to happen to him. He went out, and he said to them. So when it says that he went out, that's what did he do? He left the safety of the garden, went out of the gates, and there imagine a group of men with lanterns and torches and weapons, and they're there, and Jesus, the most peaceful, kind, loving man, comes out of the garden and stands before them. Imagine the scene. There they are. There's Lance, and here's Jesus humbly walking out, and he asks them a question. He says, who is it that you're looking for? Who is it that you're looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he answers, I am he. Ego eimi. I am. And what does John record there? John records that at the moment that he says that, they back off. They fall back. John notes that Judas was the one who was standing with them. Judas, who betrayed him, was also standing with him. He had chosen sides. He was not on the side of Jesus. He was the betrayer. He was coming, resisting Christ. And I want you to note that power that is there, that power where Jesus has the courage to step out, to face kind of the resistance of things coming at him, knowing everything that he would do. That same spirit is the spirit of power that is in us, the spirit of Christ. If you fear anything, that's why Jesus says, fear not, for I am with you. The same voice that says, I am he who you look for. They can't help. That little display of glory comes out. It's like, bam. And they're like, whoa. And they don't know what hits them. Judas is here resisting. He obviously is let down by Jesus. At some point, he decided out of greed that he was going to betray the Son of Man for just a bag full of gold. Jesus let him down. Perhaps Jesus has let you down. A church has let you down. Perhaps like you have decided sometime in your heart, be like, you know what? I'm just done with this. Maybe you're even here this morning. This is the last shot. You're like, I'm going to give the message of the gospel one more try. And if I hear just something that I don't like, then I'm out because I'm tired of being let down. Well, Judas felt the same way. He just decided, you know what? I'm going to give in to my greed. I've heard enough of what Jesus has to say. He's not going to overturn the Roman government. He's not going to do this, that, or the other thing. He has put an agenda on Jesus, and Jesus has not met that agenda, and Judas is going to betray him. He's like, I'm out. It's the resistance of our hearts. When Jesus told them, verse 6, I am he, they stepped back and they fell to the ground. That language, that force in the Greek there is that they literally fell back on their knees. And they get back up. I love Jesus. I love him not only because of the gospel, because he's just like, hey, let me ask you again, who are you looking for? Right? It's like as if that wasn't enough. And I'm going to imagine somebody in the crowd was like, don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say it. Who are we looking for? I don't know. Our mistake. We're going to go down this way. You would think that they would learn. They're like, and some smart aleck's like, Jesus of Nazareth. We're looking for him. Bracing for protection. And Jesus said, I told you, I am he. And then in his love and concern for his disciples, and his love and concern for the fact that he had promised them that he would not let them be lost, he says, so if you're looking for me, let these men go. Again, Jesus showing his heart for his people, showing his heart. And I can't help but read this and I think, oh God, make me such like Jesus that I would do that. I would stand before any resistance, whether that's for my family or for my friends, that I would be courageous enough to move into the heartache of the world, to move into a position where I'm going to at least take a hit so that I might be courageous enough to say, if the same Spirit of Christ that is in me as a believer, if it's promised that Jesus is in me and will give me courage and give me words to say, I want to be the type of man that says, I will enter into this, but I want to protect those who are behind me. That's what the church is supposed to do. The church is supposed to step into the gaps where there is violence and where there are injustices. John even says, just in case you forgot, this was to fulfill the words he said previously in the upper room in chapters 17 and 16 and 15 and all the way before that. Jesus says, I'm not going to let any of them be lost. Chapter 17, verse 6. Not one of them that you've given to me. I will not let them lose their faith. Then Simon Peter, you're going to see now, so Judas is resisting the redemptive plan of God because of his greed. His heart is exposed, and he's brought these other men to resist the Christ. But look what Peter does. In verse 10, Simon Peter, who had a sword, he drew it, and he struck the high priest's servant, and he cut off his right ear. He didn't just cut his right ear. The Greek there is used, it's a word that holtarion, which means, it's where we get wholeness. The whole ear came off. Judas is like, I got you, Jesus. Kick to the groin. Knee to the face. Cut your ear off. Judas is betraying Jesus with this group of men, and that's the disciple that's betrayed him. And here's Peter acting out his heart. He's doing the best that he can. Some of us have cooler heads that prevail. Others do not. Some of us are like, oh, come on. Jeez, Peter, what's up? Others are like, yeah, do it. I'm kind of like Peter. I'm like, dude, eat that. In another gospel, it says that Jesus took the ear and just put it back on. His name is Malchus. He was a high priest. John names him because he is known. John knows him. He's like, it was Malchus. It was this dude. And Malchus could literally say, Peter cut my ear off, and Jesus put it back on. And you would think that would be enough to stop, right? You'd think, that's crazy. Maybe we're messing with the wrong guy. But their hearts are hard. Peter endangers all that Jesus is willingly stepping into. Imagine if Peter starts cutting other people's ears. Imagine if the disciples go after him, and everything that Jesus has set up is going to be ruined because he must willfully and willingly go to the cross. And Jesus immediately takes control. Peter, whose love for Jesus does not kind of go on the course of Jesus. It takes its own course, which, by the way, that's what our hearts do. Our hearts, without the influence of Jesus, we just without the Holy Spirit, we dictate our own way. That's our problem. We want to go where we want to go. We dictate our own course. And Jesus has to step in again, as normal, as usual, and he takes control of the situation. Look at verse 11. At that time, Jesus says to Peter, "Put your sword away. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given to me?" Peter, this is not the way that this is going to go, son. The way that sentence is constructed is that the emphasis is on the Father who places am I not to drink the cup that the Father places at my lips? That's the sense of it. The Father is, and I have agreed to receive, he's bringing me the cup of wrath. John, as a good Jew, would assume that Jewish readers would know that that's the cup. The cup is the cup of wrath poured out. His will is that Jesus drinks the cup. Not you, not me. That Jesus would drink the cup. And so if Jesus has come with the very purpose to drink that cup, Peter, don't ruin this for everyone else. Note, Jesus does not need you to defend him. He does not need you to post on Facebook or Twitter. He does not need you to argue in public and defend Jesus. Jesus is quite capable of defending himself. I think we've noted that. I am he. Bam. And Peter whips out a sword. Stop. I don't need you to defend me. Confess him before others, yes. Proclaim the gospel, yes. But defend him, he does not need you to defend him. And so in verse 12, the company of soldiers, after Jesus has regained control, and not only the resistance of Judas doesn't work, nor does the resistance of Peter, which, by the way, he doesn't even know necessarily what he's resisting yet. Let's give him some grace, because we do that all the time. Jesus is coming after us in love all of the time, and sometimes we're resisting things. We don't even know that it's God's love. Sometimes we get into problems that seem overwhelmingly painful, and it's for our own good. The writer of Hebrews says, do not despise the discipline of the Lord Jesus. Because why? Because he disciplines those whom he loves. He comes after you. He weakens you. He brings you circumstances that you do not like, but you should not resist all of them, because all of them might be the love of God trying to get you to see something, or to do something, or to avoid something that is going to be to your detriment. And so the company of soldiers, they arrest Jesus and they tie him up. And they lead him to Annas, verse 13. He was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. That was relatively 18. Caiaphas was the high priest between AD 18 and AD 36. Caiaphas was the one who John says points back and says he advised the Jews that it would be better for one man to die for the purpose. He's for the people. He is the high priest. He's in control of the Sanhedrin, which was the group of Pharisees and Sadducees and the religious leaders of the day, and the high priest was like the president of the club. And so Jesus is arrested, and John wants you to see that taking control of the situation, what does Jesus do? Jesus went to the trial to face injustice on purpose. He goes to the garden to be found on purpose. Now he's going to go to a trial. He's going to go to a trial where it's going to be a completely unjust trial on purpose. Annas was a father of at least 5 high priests in that day. So Caiaphas was the son-in-law to Annas. Annas, no doubt, lived in the house of Caiaphas. That's the way that it worked. Annas was kind of taken care of by his son-in-law. And no doubt Annas had a daughter that was beautiful, that Caiaphas is like, hey, why don't you come live with us and I'll marry your daughter. All right, done. So they're living in the same house, and no doubt, as we see, there's a courtyard. It's a house where they probably would have lived. But Annas, historians would say, probably had the same influence. You couldn't have 2 high priests. You only had 1 high priest. Caiaphas was the high priest because Annas was deposed by the Roman government. Something Annas said or did, the Romans had him removed as high priest. And so in order to control the Jews, they put their own high priest in there. But Annas is the one who is really the influence behind everything else. And so Jesus is brought to Annas for a reason. Jesus is brought to Annas because Annas has something against Jesus. And no doubt, Annas is probably the one that stirred the thoughts of the men who wanted to have Jesus killed. This was a personal visit. And before Jesus would stand before the Sanhedrin, Jesus would have to go before a Sanhedrin. And by the way, guess what? You couldn't have a trial at night. It was against Jewish law. So already the Jewish leaders are deciding they're going to bend the rules just a little bit because Jesus needs to be taken care of. So let's take him at night, bring him into the house, get a trial, get him up on the cross by morning so no one would resist. They're breaking the law of Moses. But that's okay because we're righteous in our deeds. This guy is obviously a blasphemer. It's illegal according to Jewish laws. And even, in fact, if you ask a modern Jew who knows their scriptures, you take them to this passage, you have them read it and say, what's wrong with this? And they're like, oh, it's against the law. This never happened because it's against the law. No good Jew would do this. Just saying. The human heart does what it wants. Even the Mosaic law can't control a man's heart to unjustly bring a man who is not guilty of anything on trial for death and blasphemy. Verse 15. Simon Peter was following Jesus, as was another disciple, probably John. That disciple was an acquaintance. That word there, acquaintance, is one who is close. He's not a family member, but it is a close friend, an intimate friend. So John, the disciple, somehow knew Caiaphas. These men were tight. And so he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. So Jesus is saying, let these men go, but for some reason, John and Peter decide that they want to follow Jesus closely anyway. Peter follows with John, and John gets let in, and Peter's left outside the gates. And yet John lets Peter come in. He wants him to come in. So the other disciple in verse 16, who knew the high priest, went out and spoke to the girl that guarded the gate and said to Peter, come on, you can come through here. And as Peter's going through here, the servant girl, verse 17, looks at Peter and says, you aren't one of the man's disciples also, are you? Which leads us to believe that John was a known disciple of Jesus. There's courage in partnership. There's, sometimes being on a college campus is brutal when you know that everyone around you, the moment they find out that you're a Christian, you're going to not be invited to things, and you're also going to be mocked about stuff. The same as in high school, the same as in middle school. And here, Peter, who's a disciple of Jesus, who's with John, who's known as a disciple of Jesus, and the servant girl says, are you a disciple too, like John? And Peter's like, I am not. I'm just here in the middle of the night. Just heard things that are going on. Can I come in? Thanks. Now the servants and the officials were making a charcoal fire. It was cold. They were there warming themselves. John is setting the scene. Peter is outside warming himself. And Peter is afraid that he's going to be known as a disciple. It's out of fear. He does not want to be known as a disciple. He is curious. And certainly his heart loves Jesus, but he's afraid of being identified with Jesus. And one might wonder what's going on with Peter's mind right now. He knows that Jesus is in there. He's ahead. He's within earshot, because the other gospel writers say that, the moment that Peter denies him the third time and the cock crows, which is at the end of this passage, Peter looks at Jesus. Jesus looks at Peter, because Jesus had already told Peter, this is going to happen, dude. One would wonder if Peter did not follow Jesus, would he be put in the same situation? Some commentators say that perhaps John is complicit in letting Peter fall into this trap of sin, which is true. Sometimes we lead people into temptation to do something that might cause them to sin. Some would argue that Peter was led into this, but it doesn't really matter because Jesus said it was going to happen, and it happens. And Peter's there. He's already denied him once. And then the scene changes in verse 19. They're questioning him. They're saying, tell us about your disciples and your teaching. And Jesus basically says, I've taught openly. You had plenty of time to come to church on Sundays at 10 a.m. Like, I taught openly. I spoke to the world openly. I've always taught in the synagogue and the temple. And I haven't spoken anything in secret. Like, what do you want me to answer? Why do you question me? Why do you question me? Question those who heard what I told them. Okay. Note, you would not know this, but know this. John puts that in there so that you would know that this is an illegal proceeding. The process for one who is guilty of something was not that you questioned the one who was guilty first, you actually questioned the witnesses first. to prove the guilt. You were innocent, and you were not guilty until proven innocent. You were innocent until proven guilty. That's where we get that from. You had to have two witnesses. So basically, Jesus said, hey, listen, I'm looking around here, and I notice that no one is here to be questioned before me. Why are you asking me? Ask other witnesses. To which they would say, we don't have any witnesses. We're just asking you. To which Jesus would say, you're acting against the law. Why are you giving me this injustice? Let's just all be honest here, Jesus saying, this isn't an unjust trial, is it not? And how do they respond? Jesus, knowing everything that would happen to him, went out. Submits himself to an unjust trial, speaks truth, and someone slaps him in the face. To which, just let that sink in for a second. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things are held together with his breath. And there's the creator of the universe being slapped by some little peon. What does Jesus do? Well, what I would do. Just calls fire down. Bam, bam. It's like the last scene of the Avengers movie. Just, I've had enough. Right? Why wouldn't he do that? Why wouldn't he do that? Ask yourself that. Why wouldn't he do that? Because there's a much greater glory ahead for him. He does not worry about piddly little peon servants, officials. Is this the way that you answered the high priest? Verse 22, that's what he sounded like. I did some research. And Jesus says, well, if I've spoken wrongly, probably after gathering himself, why don't you give evidence about the wrong? But let me ask you a question. If I've spoken truthfully, why did you hit me? To which immediately the guilt should have set in. And what's going on here is the resistance is coming from the Jewish leadership. Jesus threatened their kingdom. Jesus threatened their law. And they bind him and they send him to Caiaphas for more injustice. So Annas has done his job and kind of stating his claim. He sends him to his son-in-law, who actually has the power. Annas has no power, but Annas wanted to take a hit. But then in verse 25, the scene changes, and we see Peter again, and this might be a familiar story to you, and Peter is asked, again, hey, aren't you one of his disciples? No, I'm not. And then one of the high priest servants in verse 26, a relative of the man, the one who's like, hey, didn't I see you? Malchus just told me someone cut his ear off. Did you cut his ear off? Because it looks great now. Did Jesus do that? Didn't I see you with him in the garden? And Peter goes, no, I didn't. And the moment that he says it, the rooster crows. And everything comes flooding. Jesus said, before the rooster crows, Peter, you're going to deny me. You're going to resist what I have to do for you 3 times. John 13:38. The thing that Jesus spoke of became reality. The fulfillment of what Jesus said happened. It came true. It was actualized. It's a moment in history that can never be rewritten. He can't take it back. You ever have one of those sins where you do something and all of a sudden you realize, I should not have sent that? Or, I should not have done that. Or, I should not have gotten involved in this. And you can't take it back. It's not redeemable. It is written. It is fact. What we see in these 3 men is the resistance to God's overtures of his love. Some of them know what they're doing. Peter does not know what he's doing. Well, the good news of the gospel is the fact that despite Peter's resistance, in the end, you'll see that Peter is restored back to his Savior. Peter, the one who denied Jesus 3 times, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, 3rd time, do you love me? And Peter says, of course I do. And it is the overture of God's love that the only way that Christ can come to Peter and say, you denied me 3 times, Peter. But you denied me not knowing that I had to go to the cross and to suffer. Jesus went to the garden. He says, Jesus, don't you know that I went to the garden on purpose? Don't you know that I knew what I was doing? I had to step out of the garden. Don't you know that I knew everything that was going to happen to me? And I was doing it willfully. I did not want anything to stop because I love you, Peter. He loves you. Paul writes to the Galatian church and he says, of all of the apostles, I am the least. I persecuted the church. I murdered them. I killed them. And yet as one that was the least of these, born at the wrong time, Christ Jesus looked at me and says, Paul, why are you resisting me? Why? And he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, the Spirit of Christ in me, I live by faith in the Son of God, and this is important, who loved me and gave himself for me. Let that sink in. Read that over and over and over again, because this is the good news of the gospel. Christ has not said, I went to the cross to set an example for you so that you might suffer through life and earn my salvation through penance and through acts of charity and mercy, attendance at church, all of these lists of things you can do for my love. Jesus says, I paid your debt. Your debt is paid in full because I love you. How do we resist the persistent love of God? Well, we do it a lot. But yet, in the grace of God, he does not discontinue coming after us. Is that not good news? So wherever you're at this morning, the gospel, the good news is that you may have resisted him this week. You may be even sitting there right now wondering if Jesus Christ is truly the Lord and Savior of everything that we say that he is, that he really did. He went to the cross for you. He went to the cross for me. He must be a personal Savior. You cannot know Jesus through someone else. You must know Jesus, and it starts with looking at the cross and knowing that he went through all of that willingly, knowingly, on purpose for you and for me. And he will never take that away from you.